Okay, so let me begin with free will. So I want to focus, at least for the first part of the presentation on Chapter 7 of Touching a Nerve. And there Pat begins with a discussion of the view on freedom and control to which he's opposed, namely a view she calls the contra-causal account. Okay? So at least as a, to begin with, the idea is that the contra-causalist believes that freely willed decisions are uncaused. And I think we have an example with Immanuel Kant, at least given his idea of transcendental freedom. So Kant says that transcendentally free actions are caused by me, and I'm not caused by anything to cause these actions. There's an example. So one thought that a lot of people have is that such things have to be outside the order of nature, so they can't be physical. So they have to be in some sense non-physical, and we call these non-physical things, like non-physical agents, souls. Okay, so we've got some problems that Pat cites. First, acting on reasons at least seems to involve functions carried out by the brain. And the brain's a physical thing, and these functions are going to be causal. So that's one factor that makes a lot of people think that the non-causal account can't work. Another one is that Pat, evidence for a non-physical soul is weak. Okay? So it's another reason to reject the non-causal account. And thirdly, sometimes actions seem caused. So in cases of, let's say, overwhelming fear, phenomenologically it seems as if your action is caused by whatever factors are causing the fear. Okay? So there we have at least some evidence for against a contra-causal account. Now you might want to extend the notion of a contra-causal account to accounts that involve merely indeterministic causation. Okay, that's maybe a natural extension. So if you think about libertarians nowadays, like Kane, like yesterday we spent a lot of time talking about Kane, and agent causal libertarians, typically what they want to do nowadays is integrate the Davidsonian account of reasons causation. So before 1963, or at least before Davidson started talking about this, a lot of people were, maybe the majority of people, at least in analytic philosophy, were non-causalist about reasons, hey, the reasons' effect on actions. Whereas that article convinced, let's say a majority of the people, maybe 90% of the people who think about this, that reasons are causes. Right? Not everybody agrees. For example, my colleague Carl Genet is a non-causalist about reasons causation, and Martina, for example, is a non-causalist about reasons causation. So the effect of reasons on action. So it's not a universal view. But just as a matter of historical and sociological fact, libertarians have tried to build reasons causation into their indeterministic accounts of action. So we saw a good example of this yesterday with Bob Kane, and there are libertarian agent causalists who hold this view as well. But it turns out to be very difficult to do. Right? And one problem that arises for libertarians like Kane is that it seems maybe even impossible to integrate control with indeterministic causation. Okay, indeterministic causation by reasons. Here's a kind of a quick example from the agent causal literature. So intuitively we want, if you're an agent causalist, you want the agent qua substance to cause the action, but you also want the reasons to cause the action. So what Randy Clark does, he says, look, every action that is a free action is a result of two causal streams, one involving the agent cause and another involving the reasons. Then there's this question about how they're integrated. Right? Intuitively, it's the case that when agents cause actions, they cause actions for reasons, but if the streams are separate, right, and not integrated, it seems that the agent is causing the action non-rationally or irrationally. Okay, so there's a big problem. So yeah, I think I want to agree with Pat that certainly contra-causal accounts of action are on the ropes, as are libertarian accounts more generally. Okay, so now secondly, for the positive account, what Pat says is ordinarily if you're intending your action, knowing what you're doing, and are of sound mind, and if the decision is not coerced, you're exhibiting free will. Okay, so and free will, on Pat's view, is a kind of control in action. And I want to say there, even though that I'm, I suppose in some sense I'm an anti-free will person, I want to agree with Pat that this is at least one legitimate definition of free will. Okay? So it's a definition of free will according to which I think most people who are on the books as free will deniers, at least in philosophy as free will deniers, they can accept that we're free in the sense that Pat sets out here. So again, if you're intending your action, knowing what you're doing, and are of sound mind, and if the decision is not coerced, you're exhibiting free will. Okay. Look, it turns out to be the case that this actually divides the maybe philosophical landscape in some broad sense of philosophical into groups, because there are people that don't think that we have free will in this sense. Maybe the people that follow Libet, the Libet view about how action works, that there's no conscious control in action. Maybe Pat's view would be one that they deny. And perhaps there's some situationists. Pat talks about situationists, and we'll talk more about them in a minute, who want to say that the situationist examples, like the Princeton Seminary case that Jesse was talking about yesterday, show that in some general sense we lack the control in action that is specified by this definition of free will. Okay, but we'll talk a bit more about that in the critical discussion part of my presentation. So both Pat and I agree that the free will discussion has some impact on criminology. Okay? But at least Pat wants to say this. Look, so maybe here's at least an interesting kind of division of characters in this debate. Some people think that the free will debate can make a difference for what we should do with criminals. Other people think it shouldn't. Okay, so an example of somebody who thinks it shouldn't is maybe Strawson. So Strawson thinks that he's kind of an insulationist. He thinks nothing about the free will debate should touch practice, right? And practice there includes a practice of dealing with criminal offenders. Okay, now it may seem as if what Pat's saying is that our reflections on free will should not impact criminology, but that's not what she really thinks. Anyway, so in the book she says, for many criminal cases, the question of lack of self-control does not seriously arise, but sometimes it does. For example, sudden loss of self-control in the case of overwhelming fear of serious violence. Okay, so in a case like that, maybe the court should be lenient. Okay? So there we have perhaps diminished control. And one point that Pat wants to make is that diminished control is possible, and so diminished free will is possible. So free will comes in degrees, right? On your view. Good. And here's one point, interesting point that she makes. If free will is illusory, as some of these folks are maintaining, that means that there's no difference between a brain with self-control and one lacking self-control, or one with diminished self-control. And that claim is flatly at odds with the fact. So free will understood as self-control, right? We've got to have free will understood as self-control if there can in fact be these differences, and it's pretty evident that there are these differences. Okay, so what we want to say about free will and control is relevant to criminology because we have these cases of sudden loss or absence of self-control, okay? And there we want to say that free will is diminished, perhaps even absent, okay, in the relevant sense. And so the courts in those cases should be lenient. Hey, we have other kinds of cases in which the maybe a diminishment of self-control is, at least there's some evidence for diminishment of self-control. For example, there's this big New Zealand study that shows that males, at least New Zealand males, who have a certain genetic variant for the enzyme monoamine oxidase A or MAOA and were abused as children tend to show self-destructive and resilient aggression. These are pretty robust results, right? Yeah.
In that population?
In that population, in the New Zealand population. And there's a question about whether this is replicable, for example, in a non-homogeneous population like the United States. Good. And neither their genes nor the abuse was under the control of these males. So there's another case in which we might have diminished self-control. But it's not general. Okay, that's the point you want to make. There's not a general sort of diminishment of self-control. Maybe in these special cases there is, and the courts have to take this into consideration, but it's not general. Okay. Then the papers with Schuler focus on situationism. Okay, so situationism is the view that, there's a radical sort of situationism that claims that actions are not at all a function of, say, character. They're, for the most part, a function of the situation that somebody's in. And there are a lot of these experiments that purportedly show that this is the case. For example, the Princeton Seminary study that Jesse was talking about yesterday. There's also the Milgram experiments done at Yale in the early 60s, where subjects were told by authority figures to shock other people, in fact, to the level of unconsciousness, and a lot of them, apparent unconsciousness anyway, and a pretty large percentage of them agreed to do this. And we have positive cases as well. Here's one that's apparently very difficult to replicate. That subjects were told to go, I think it was just 40 subjects were told to go into a phone booth. In half the cases, the subjects found a coin in the coin slot, and then they were told to leave. At this point, there was an actor dropping a bunch of manila folders on the ground. And apparently in all the cases in which the person found the coin in the slot, they helped the person pick up the manila envelopes, or almost all of them.
No, just a majority.
A majority?
Yeah.
70-some percent, 70-some percent. And for 9% the other way around, is that how it goes? 9%. Anyway, so a very small percentage helped the person pick up the manila envelopes in cases where no coin was found. Okay, so this is evidence that situation is used to try to show that actions are a function of situation and not and are not controlled in the relevant sense by the agent. Okay, so Pat's going to focus on this some in her part of the presentation. She and Schuler show that, argue that situation is false. Situationism is false for the following sort of reason, that neuroanatomical studies help us show that in these kinds of cases, the relevant sort of self-control is in place. Okay, there's massive evidence that the relevant sort of self-control is in place, and I think you might want to allow that these kinds of situations. There's maybe some minor diminishment of control, but it's not relevant to responsibility. Okay, so and this has the argument has two phases. Right? First one is that brain structures essential for control functions are intact. Okay, that's the anatomical condition. And the second one is that circumstances studied are usually within the typical range encountered in the evolutionary past of humans, and thus levels of various neurochemicals on which the proper functioning of the anatomical structures depends can reasonably be expected to be within their normal ranges. And that's the physiological condition. Okay, so the idea is that even in the situationist examples, the anatomical condition holds and the physiological condition holds, and this is good reason to believe that the sort of control required for responsibility is present in these kinds of cases. Okay. Now, one thing that Pat and Schuler also argue is that in many of these cases, part of what this shows is that the sort of control that we have in mind here is compatible with the relevant sort of action process being non-conscious. Okay, so in lots of kind of cases in which after certain kinds of actions for which we're intuitively responsible become routine, those routines will become non-conscious, and there's no good reason to believe that when these processes become non-conscious, control is diminished. Okay? So it's not in general true that non-consciousness diminishes control. So that's a kind of important spin-off of the studies in these two articles. Okay. So let me raise some points for discussion here. So I want to say that I agree with virtually everything Pat says about free will and control, and maybe everything that she really thinks, but let me raise a kind of an issue for the account as presented in Chapter 7 of Touching a Nerve. Okay, so there are different notions of free will that we have. I don't think that free will, there's just one concept of free will. Some people in the free will debate say that, oh, free will is a natural kind and there's just one notion. I think there's no way that's true. So if I think that the notion of free will that you employ in this chapter is a legitimate one. The idea is free will is the sort of control required maybe for some sort of moral responsibility. Hey, and I do in fact think that we have the sort of control in action required for moral responsibility of some sort. But yet, as I've been saying, I think that there's a notion of moral responsibility that requires a certain, I think, very high level of control that we don't in fact have. Okay? And that sort of moral responsibility I call basic desert moral responsibility. Okay? And some of the students asked me to say something about what basic desert moral responsibility is, and so this gives me an opportunity to do so. Okay, so the idea is this, that, look, I mean, desert is, well, at least maybe not desert, but the term deserve is an ordinary language term. It's really squishy. It means lots of different things. Okay? It's not a term that's kind of philosophically controlled. Hey, so I think that the core notion of desert in philosophical discussions is a certain kind of basic desert. And what basic desert is at least here's the kind of negative, here's a characterization of negative basic desert. Okay? So a person deserves, to be blamed in the basic desert sense if it's the case that the person is legitimately blamed, right, just because she's knowingly performed a bad action. Right? And the justification for blaming is not founded in either consequentialist or contractualist considerations. Okay? So it's basic in that sense. So one way to put it is the person should be blamed in these situations just because she's knowingly performed the action, okay, for no other reason. And we see this notion, for example, in Kant at a certain point, right, in Metaphysical Elements of Justice, where he asks, so why should criminals be punished? And the answer is, well, they should be punished just because they've committed a crime and for no other reason. He says you can't look to consequentialist considerations because this would involve using the person merely as a means, okay, and that's a mistake. So the right way of thinking about criminal punishment is in terms of basic desert. Hey, and that's typically called the retributivist notion of punishment. Okay, so I think it's possible to have the kind of control in action that Pat specifies in her definition of free will without having the sort of control required for basic desert moral responsibility. And I want to argue that in the way that I want to argue that by means of a manipulation argument, typically. I think that I guess my view is that there's no principal difference between an agent that's manipulated by another agent, at least principal difference in the sense of a difference that's relevant to basic desert moral responsibility, for an agent who's manipulated by another agent into performing an action, and an agent who's causally determined in an ordinary sense to perform an action. And I think it's intuitive that that first agent isn't going to be morally responsible in the basic desert sense. So the conclusion is going to be that the agent who's causally determined in the ordinary sense isn't morally responsible in the basic desert sense either. Okay, so that's kind of a quick sketch of the kind of argument that I want to advance for that kind of claim. Okay, so one discussion that I've been having with Dan is about whether our punishment practices should change if, say, causal determinism is true, if we don't have free will in the basic desert sense. And again, insulationists like Strawson want to say that the practices don't change. And I want to say that the practices should change. Okay, now some practices don't change. The thing is that Dan has this very nice review of this guy, Bruce Waller, who thinks that, look, we're not morally responsible at all if determinism is true. Okay, so we've got to get rid of all of our criminological practices and substitute maybe Skinnerian behaviorist conditioning for our criminology. And I want to disagree with that. I think that's not the right way to go. Dan thinks that there are lots of good empirical reasons for thinking that that sort of scheme won't work, and I agree with Dan on that issue. Okay, so how does this all shake out? Well, first of all, I think that once you get rid of retributivism as a justification for punishment, what's left is deterrence. We're interested in protection. Right? We're interested in protecting people from threats. And as I was saying the other day, my notion of moral responsibility is this, that even when we get rid of the basic desert component, we retain a certain forward-looking component of our practice of holding people morally responsible. And the forward-looking elements aim at protection, at moral formation, and at reconciliation. And punishment policy, it's protection that's the most important of these three factors. Okay, so what reason do we have to punish people even if causal determinism is true? And the answer is we want to protect people. Right? And so what's invoked here is the deterrence theory of punishment. Now, yes, I think that if the kinds of punishment envisioned are just fines, okay, then you can't find people who haven't done something that haven't done anything wrong. Right? So, and we typically think that if the government says, like, I've got to pay him a certain amount of money, even though I haven't done anything wrong, and it's not justified on the basis of let's say, legitimate claims to tax, then it's a violation of property rights. Right? So, but I'm not so worried about a consequentialist scheme, say, for fining speeders, because the only worry there is that there's a property right that's violated. And it turns out that I think that the interests we have in protecting society outweigh our property rights in that kind of situation. Okay? So I think that a system of fines for speeding is legitimate just because property rights are relatively weak. Okay? Now the kinds of rights that aren't weak, that are at play in punishment policy, are the right to life, okay? If the death penalty is being considered, or the right to liberty if incarceration is being considered, or the right not to be tortured, right? If you're thinking of torturing criminals, okay? Which still occurs. So what about a deterrence theory that proposes to, say, incarcerate people or institute the death penalty? Okay? There are certain kind of worry for a consequentialist deterrence theory kicks in, one that Kant also invokes, namely this, the use objection. Aren't you using people merely as a means if you kill them in order to deter, say, others from committing crimes? Or aren't you using people merely as a means if you incarcerate them in order to deter others from committing crimes? And for me, this use objection is very weighty, right? Very weighty. So I think that it's really going to be difficult to make a deterrence theory plausible if that deterrence theory aims to justify, say, incarceration or the death penalty. Okay? Now, if you look at actual deterrence theories of punishment, like some people think that, like Tom Hill, who's a Kantian at the University of North Carolina, thinks that Kant really has a deterrence theory of punishment. Because at this point we can ask the following question. So what does the state legitimately do in the case of criminals? Well, what's the state's role? The state's role is to protect citizens. Okay, that's the kind of salient state role when it comes to criminals. The state doesn't have at least a direct role in giving criminals what they deserve. Right? Why would it? If that had a direct role, if it was kind of directly justified in giving criminals what they deserve, you'd think that there'd be a kind of a positive police as well, right? A police force that would look for people who did good things and reward them. But nobody thinks that that is a legitimate state function. Right? So the state role there is what? It's not to give people what they deserve, but on Hill's account of Kant, it's really to, like, protect. Okay? But Kant says there's a big worry about the state protecting people by instituting, say, the death penalty or a program of incarceration, and it's the use objection. But what gets us around the use objection is retribution. Right? It's because these criminals deserve, right, in some prima facie sense, to be harmed because of what they've done, and the fact that they deserve to be harmed allows the state at this point to step in and legitimately kind of use these people for purposes of deterrence. Right? And another really good, very interesting deterrence theory is that of Daniel Farrell at Ohio State, and he also thinks that there's a retributive principle that's essential to a legitimate deterrence theory. Okay? So in both cases, the worry is about use. And what gets you around the use objection is retribution, the legitimacy of retribution. But if you don't think that retribution is legitimate, then I think you're stuck with the use objection. Okay, so I want to do it differently. For the really dangerous criminals, I'm not talking about the speeders here or the tax evaders. Rather, I'm talking about the people that are genuinely dangerous. And there I want to invoke the quarantine analogy. Okay? So people that are carriers of cholera, we think it's legitimate to quarantine them, even if they're not morally responsible for being carriers of cholera. Okay? So if we think that that's legitimate in the interest of protection of society, it stands to reason that it would be legitimate to incapacitate, perhaps by incarceration, or quarantine dangerous criminals in order to protect society. Okay, just on the quarantine analogy. Doesn't mean you have to quarantine all the criminals, just the really dangerous ones. So that's going to be my justification for incapacitation, as opposed to, let's say, utilitarian deterrence theory, retribution theory. It's going to be the quarantine analogy. Okay? Yes, okay. Let me say a couple more things. One is this. So just let me raise one case in response to this point about unconsciousness. So there's this recent book by Neil Levy called Consciousness and Moral Responsibility, which argues perhaps on the opposite side of Pat on whether unconscious acts can be morally responsible. So Levy has this kind of interesting case that he invokes. This is the center of the book. He says, take for dramatic illustration the well-known case of Kenneth Parkes. In the early hours of May 24, 1987, Parkes rose from the couch on which he was lying in front of the TV, put on his shoes and jacket, walked to his car and drove 23 kilometers to the home of his parents-in-law. He entered the house, strangled his father-in-law into unconsciousness, and stabbed his mother-in-law repeatedly. He then left the house and drove to the police station, where he told the police that he thought he had killed some people. Only then, apparently, did he notice his severely injured arms, in which the tendons had been severed. So the idea was, anyway, the idea of the book is that, of Levy and also of the courts who judged this case, is that he was asleep while he performed these actions. Okay, so unconscious. So how does Levy analyze what's going on? Well, he invokes at this point the global workspace account of consciousness, and he says that, look, when you're asleep, you have a certain action routine, right? A certain action routine in the somnambulist can be invoked. But the problem is, if you're not conscious, this action routine doesn't have access to the center that whose function is kind of moral sensitivity and moral reasoning. And it's only, right? It's only when you're conscious that that you've got that global broadcasting is at work, and you've got integration between this action routine and the area that's responsible for moral sensitivity and moral reasoning. Okay? So he's thinking that this kind of case shows that consciousness at some level is required for responsibility. I'm interested in what Pat has to say about this. Okay, thank you.